Hello and welcome to the very first lunch hour of 2025. This is also marking 5 years since the UK withdrew from the European Union. Joining me is the research team, Stephen Hunsaker, Sophie Stowers, Joël Reland, Jannike Wachowiak, and all with the, I'm noticing, universally white background of King's College London. Shockingly, we're all in the same building. Today, we're going to talk about the UK relationship 5 years after Brexit, what kind of impact it's having and continues to have, and also what we should be thinking about going forward. Remember, if you have any questions for us on the team, you can leave them for us, and I'll try and get to them very soon. But let's start off with Jannike. 5 years on from Brexit, that's going to be a refrain for me throughout the next hour. What is the state of UK-EU cooperation?
Thanks, Joelle. Well, I would say 5 years on from Brexit, we've finally reached a sort of stable equilibrium in the relationship. I mean, as everyone listening will probably know, the relationship is governed by the withdrawal agreement and the trade and cooperation agreement. I'd say they're both functioning reasonably well. With the withdrawal agreement in particular, there is ongoing implementation and close attention is being paid to citizens' rights, but also the Windsor framework in particular. When it comes to the trade and cooperation agreement, some of its implementation was delayed over the past years due to frictions over the Northern Ireland Protocol in particular. That's been resolved with the Windsor framework, and I would say, since the Windsor framework, the relationship has entered much calmer waters. That doesn't mean that trust has been 100% restored, though, I would say. And I think that's quite evident if you look at the way the European Union is, for example, linking the implementation of the existing agreements with any progress or discussions that could be had on kind of new areas of cooperation. And I would also say that with the existing agreements, implementation is not always going to be easy. Even right now, we're seeing that there is a formal dispute that has been launched for the first time on fisheries. There are lots of outstanding issues on Gibraltar. There are parts of the TCA that are going to expire in the next years on fisheries, on energy. So it kind of continues to be an interesting journey for the two sides. And I think there is a possibility that the existing agreements might interfere with plans for new areas of cooperation this year and in the coming years.
We'll certainly be talking about the years ahead. But let's just think about the UK now. It's no longer a member state of the European Union. There was such huge expectation that this would radically change how the UK operated and what it would do. Joël, king of regulatory divergence, how radically has the UK changed?
Okay, well, the very short answer is not much at all. But the slightly more nuanced answer is I think this is one of the big interesting questions going into the year ahead. To deal with the first bit first, so Boris Johnson obviously elected, promising not only to get Brexit done, but basically to use those Brexit freedoms, no longer being subject to EU rules and regulations, to really remake the UK economy. That was kind of the big sell of Brexit as a political project. But failed for a number of reasons that I'm not really going to go into now because you could talk about it for quite a long time. But in essence, the EU remains our sort of largest trading market. And therefore, if you try and diverge, if you try and move away from EU rules and regulations, you make that trade harder and business doesn't really want that. So most plans for divergence never really took root. And under Rishi Sunak's government, it was kind of accepted that as a status quo, it'd be better to remain more or less aligned with the EU and not try and move away further and make that trade more complicated. That's an analysis which is now shared by Keir Starmer and the Labour government. But the key difference with this new government is this attention to alignment as well, because you don't only have the question of how might the UK try to move away from the EU, but you have the fact that the EU continues to do things differently now that we're not a member state. And obviously, we don't follow those new rules and regulations. So if the EU has a new rule on, say, packaging design, packaging waste, we're not subject to that. That means new complexity when you're trying to move a packaged good across the border. So the big challenge is can you try and align with those regulations in order to minimize new trade frictions from that what we call passive divergence, where the EU is changing its rules? And this is, I think, one of the really big topics for this year on the UKEU front is Labour's strategy around alignment, because there's a bill in the works called the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill, which effectively looks like it's going to give the UK government powers to mirror EU regulations related to product design, more or less. So lots of goods regulations that relate to packaged goods. This could help minimize that future trade friction, but there is a big question about how frequently the government is going to try and use it. Is it going to try and effectively, wholesale by default align with EU regulation wherever it can, or is it going to do it in a much more limited, selected manner where it sees a really specific need to, perhaps related to minimizing frictions with Northern Ireland or something like that? We don't really know yet. The government hasn't been very explicit in spelling out its rationale behind the bill, and so that's a big question to watch. And there's also the question alongside the how will it use it, of whether it provokes any political reaction, because the bill actually is quite controversial in terms of methods, because it's using secondary legislation, so not acts of parliament, very little ability for MPs to scrutinise or reject kind of these rule changes where the UK is effectively mirroring EU regulation, and the UK Parliament has a limited ability to have any say over that. That's obviously tapping into a lot of the salient and sort of very sensitive issues around democracy, sovereignty, which were at the heart of the original Brexit decision in 2016. And so you could easily see the Conservative opposition or Reform really latching onto that and accusing Labour of kind of betraying Brexit, going against the will of the people and so forth. So it's an interesting policy question. It's an interesting political question, and something that I certainly will be keeping my eye on.
And we are very excited to hear your thoughts. But Stephen, Joelle has laid out some of the challenges to trade, but where exactly have we got to with trade? Has there been a radical change in pre-Brexit trade between the UK and the EU?
So yeah, the story of UK trade post-Brexit can probably simply be summed up as goods trade has declined and services have far exceeded expectation. And so when we look at that, is goods trade actually, it's important to recognize that like this trend of actually goods declining far precedes Brexit. And additionally, with the introduction of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, coming about during a time of both a global pandemic and then followed up with the energy crisis spurred on by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, goods had there's a lot of compounding variables in there that have made it so that it's difficult to piece out and say, oh, exactly, this is how much Brexit has affected that. The ONS and OBR do have predictions that Brexit has affected trade by around 15%. But what is really interesting about that is that it's not been particularly in the way you would expect it. The EU trade with the EU on goods has actually not gone down as much as expected. A lot of this has been the performance of the EU has actually been slightly better than the rest of the world, and it's been actually the rest of the world that has fallen quite significantly in the last little while. And the reason for that is that following the energy crisis, when we looked at the price of gas that kind of skyrocketed, that very much benefited many of our trading partners, particularly Norway, where we were doing a lot of gas trade, but also geopolitical tensions that were spurred on by the relationship that China had with Russia, and therefore our kind of the pressure to de-risk, kind of friend-shoring, these ideas of kind of pushing away from building trade with China. That's caused kind of trade from the rest of the world to decline, while trade with the EU has stayed relatively stable. While there was a dip when the TCA was initially implemented, it's returned to those previous levels, very much kind of subverting expectations. As for goods, though, that has been services. As for services, that's actually been the very kind of surprising point. Since now, while the end of the Brexit transition period we did initially see a little bit of a hit to services, they were able to very quickly recover, and we've actually seen very, very strong growth. I mean, year over year growth in 2023, at the end of 2023, was 6.7% higher, one of the strongest years that we'd seen in real volume numbers to date. And that trend has continued, though maybe the pace has slowed a little bit, but there still is strong signs of just this trend that has happened for some time continuing, being that the UK is becoming more of a services-oriented economy and less of a goods-oriented economy. And the one thing that's interesting about that, though, is that our trade with the EU is predominantly goods, while trade with, say, the US, our largest single country trading partner, though the EU still makes up over 52% of all UK trade, goods trade in particular. The services trade, on the other hand, is very strongly geared towards the US. And so it'll be interesting to see how that starts to play out as the US, and we'll get into that later on, but as these kind of geopolitical tensions happen, what will happen with kind of our trade relations as we become more of a service-oriented economy? Will that push us towards our trading partners that we are more inclined to trade services with, such as the US?
So we have a good idea of, say, the state of the UK-EU relationship politically, legally, in regulatory terms, in trade terms. And I think anyone, and I'm certain that anyone watching will remember the incredibly fraught years of Brexit negotiations and Brexit perception. Sophie, where is public polling now on the UK-EU relationship?
So I think since probably about early 2022, I think if you look at public opinion polls, when voters have been asked if there was another referendum, would they like to rejoin the EU or would they like to stay out? There's been a slight majority for rejoin. How kind of wide or narrow that gap has been has ebbed and flowed. I think it's narrowed slightly in the last probably year and a half or so to about 4 or 5% lead, but that's been quite consistent since 2022. And, you know, some of that is because of demographic change. So a lot of younger voters who tend to be more pro-EU have come of voting age and been socialised into the electorate. And a lot of those who voted Leave in 2016 are, you know, no longer registered to vote, let's put it that way, no longer with us. And so they're no longer kind of counted in polls and things. So some of that is just demographic shifts. But actually, there is quite a significant minority, let's say, of Leavers who have changed their minds since 2016, who now have come to regret the way they voted and, you know, would like to rejoin if given the opportunity. I think the most recent poll we have on that is from Redfield and Wilton in August last year. It's about 23%. So, you know, not a majority, but quite a sizable chunk of people who voted in 2016. But things are a bit more complicated than they seem from all those statistics that I've kind of just thrown out there, in that a lot of people who voted Leave haven't changed their minds. They might be unhappy with the course that Brexit has taken, you know, but their kind of issue is not necessarily with the UK's decision to leave the EU in itself, but the way that Brexit has been implemented, the choices that politicians and previous governments have made about the UK's relationship with the EU. They still overall think that Brexit, you know, is a positive thing, but it's just not been implemented in the way they necessarily like. And so for a lot of Leavers who have changed their minds since 2016, there is the possibility that if Brexit was implemented in a different way, that's more to their liking, they may be liable to change their minds and be in favour of staying out once again. So it's quite kind of a dynamic shift in public opinion that goes back and forth. We also see that a lot of public opinion about Brexit is not necessarily to do with Brexit itself, but it's actually quite closely tied to people's valuations of other issues that are important to them. So with the economy, you know, the state of the health service and the NHS, migration. Obviously, you can't separate all those things out from Brexit. Brexit has had consequences for each of those policy areas. But we see that, for example, when people generally think that the economy has been doing better, their evaluations of Brexit become more positive as well. So it's quite difficult to kind of untie voters' views of the UK's relationship with the EU with all these other things that matter to them. And then I think the other thing I would say is that actually when we look at discontent with Brexit, the main beneficiary of that hasn't been pro-Remain parties necessarily, despite us seeing in these polls that the idea of rejoin actually has a lead over staying out of the EU. It's actually been parties like Reform UK. In the election in July, they actually got a higher percentage of vote share than UKIP had ever achieved, including in 2015, when I think UKIP won about 13%. Reform got more than that this time around. And actually, I think the fact that so many discontented Leavers may have left, the Conservatives who they voted for in 2019 to get Brexit done and shifted over to Reform has actually made a lot of the main political parties kind of a bit more cautious about talking about the EU, about talking about a closer relationship or closer cooperation, because actually Reform seemed to have been the main beneficiary of discontent around Brexit, as opposed to those kind of Remain parties. So I would say there certainly has been a shift. Evaluations of Brexit have tended to be more negative than positive, particularly since 2022. But to just assume that means that there's a major pro-rejoining Brexit was a horrendous idea, let's go backwards mood in the country, it's actually quite a lot more complicated than that.
Far more nuanced, I think, is going to be one of the key points that will be talked about a lot. But Sophie, let's stay with you. One of the biggest changes over the summer was a new government. So, new government, new opportunities?
I think that's certainly the mood within Labour. I think there is a perception that by virtue of just not being the last lot, they will automatically have a better relationship with partners in Europe. So certainly within government, I think there is a kind of cautious move towards, we can have this closer cooperation, which I'm sure Jannike and Joelle and Stephen can go into more detail about. But in terms of kind of the public mood and how that might be received, I think what's really interesting is that actually at the election in July, Brexit was not particularly on the agenda at all. If you look at when we ask voters, what's the most important issue facing the country, in your opinion, the UKEU relationship has just completely kind of gone off a cliff. It's nowhere near, I don't even think the top 5 or top 6 most important issues to voters. A very low, I think about 7 or 8% at one time over the last year said it was the most important issue. That's obviously completely different to what we were seeing around the 2019 election. But actually, when you look then at kind of how people voted, 2016 vote versus 2024 vote, it is still the case that a lot of people who voted Leave vote Conservative or for Reform, which we know is the successor to the Brexit Party, and kind of inherited a lot of UKIP's support. And when we look at Labour, a lot of their vote base was made up of Remain voters. So it's this kind of thing that I think Professor Jane Green talks about as kind of the tide of Brexit might have gone out. It's not as much of an important issue for voters anymore. But actually those tribes, those voter coalitions are still very much underpinning party support, as we saw in July. And so actually, even though, we might not be talking about Brexit very much at the minute, Labour might feel cautiously optimistic about their potential future relationship with the EU, but they don't feel much pressure to do anything immediately because Brexit's not seen to be a major issue. Actually, that might change over time because a big chunk of their support, the majority of their support, is incredibly pro-Remain and pro-EU. So how that changes and how those shifts in pressure affect them in the future, I think will be really interesting to watch.
This is really something that the government will have to keep in mind. But Joelle, going over to you, we've heard a lot about a reset of relations. I think I've even heard about a reset of the reset of relations. Joelle, what on earth is everyone talking about?
Yeah, very good question. And more or less, we've been having the same conversations for about 6 months, I say. There's not really been very much progress at all in substantive terms. There's been progress in the sense that Keir Starmer's government has been more proactive in travelling to European capitals, showing sort of willing engagement and a desire to deepen the relationship. That is definitely a difference compared to their predecessors. But there are still a lot of outstanding questions on how you actually deliver the reset in practice. There's questions around policy and there's questions around process. To deal with policy first. So, Labour's manifesto had 4 policies in it, I think, maybe 3. Security Pact, a deal on professional qualifications, on a veterinary agreement, and something on touring artists as well. But we still haven't had any more substantive detail on what that means. So, for example, a veterinary agreement Is it full-scale alignment with EU regulations, or is it some degree of kind of where you have more trust in the relationship, but not the full harmonization of rules, which is what New Zealand has. Potentially the EU wouldn't accept that, but we don't know what's really on the table until Labour actually makes proposals. So in all those areas where they've focused on, where they've specified something, we don't know in any detail what it actually means. And we've also seen the government hint at the fact that these might just be examples of what they want to do. And there might be more to come, I don't know, on energy, for example. But again, we've not seen the detail. I mean, quite possibly they're having really intensive negotiations behind closed doors or discussions in Brussels and London. But as far as anyone in, the public domain is aware, we're still really in the early stages of defining Labour's ask. And obviously, if you don't have an ask, it's very hard to actually begin negotiations. And that brings me to then the second point, which is the process. How do you actually conduct this reset? How, in practice, do you secure the agreements which the UK says it wants? There's a question of timing. We know there's going to be a kind of initial meeting of the parties in February in Brussels, and then maybe a formal summit later in the spring or in the first half of 2025. But then how does that lead on into talks? How do these work? Are they all linked? Do you have lots of different negotiations? And also the most crucial question, I think, from the UK perspective is how do you get the EU to come to the negotiating table? Because the EU is relatively happy with the TCA as it stands. It doesn't feel the trade frictions to the same extent that the UK does. And so there's not a big incentive for it to come and negotiate unless there is something on offer for it. The obvious thing that the EU would like is a youth mobility agreement. But this is something which the UK government continues to rule out, saying that it will not, that it's, tantamount to a return to freedom of movement. I think that's incorrect, to be honest. But as long as they maintain that position, it's going to be really hard to, provide this youth mobility agreement, which is what the EU wants to come to the negotiating table. So this whole, how do we conduct a negotiation strategically, which creates benefits for both sides? I think the thinking still needs quite a lot of fleshing out. And I think there's quite a big risk of drift over the course of this year. For one reason, because unlike the initial negotiations for the withdrawal agreement and the TCA, there's no threat of no deal or a hard Brexit or kind of, a undesirable deadline if nothing happens. If nothing happens, we just stay where we are. And where we are is okay, both sides seem to think. So you don't have that same kind of cliff edge that you're pushing up against, which really forces minds together and forces you to deliver outcomes. And then the second reason is just politics gets in the way at home. Labour has a lot on its plate, I think that's fair to say. And the benefits that it is going to get from any of these proposed deals with the EU are really quite limited. In economic terms, it's debatable whether it will have any macro effect at all on UK GDP, and certainly not really in the next couple of years. So there's not going to be much of an electoral benefit to the government. So that really reduces perhaps, the incentive to get that done when you've got competing pressures. And then you add to that the potential political costs in terms of, the opposition standing up and saying, this is undoing Brexit if you start to align with EU veterinary regulations. There have been some, I can't remember the line, bad not used just before Christmas, but she kind of emphasised that at the last PMQs, this notion of Labour undoing Brexit. So there's a political risk and potentially limited economic gain. So those factors aren't necessarily that strong incentive for Labour either. And given the EU's relative satisfaction, I can really see this kind of meandering and drifting and becoming a more and more fragmented reset over time, rather than something which really crystallizes and accelerates, because I'm just not sure the will is there on either side.
I think the will being there to come to the table is so critical. Jannike, what does the EU think here? What would their priorities be in the coming year?
I think, in general, I would say that the EU has welcomed Labour's ambition to improve relations. Since Labour took office, we've seen a lot of meetings between Keir Starmer, Ursula von der Leyen, Nick Thomas-Symonds and Maroš Šefčovič in the European Commission, other UK ministers, Rachel Reeves attending a council meeting of finance ministers in the EU, and Starmer also visited a lot of capitals. And I think in general, this kind of diplomatic tour de force of the first few months has been positively received. But at the same time, I think there is now some impatience in the EU. about the lack of detail from the UK side. I mean, as Joelle has just outlined, the manifesto contains 4 proposals, 3 on trade and then the security pact, but not much beyond this. So I think the EU is really waiting for more detail from the UK side, whilst at the same time also firming up its own position. So what we've seen over the last few months is that the Working Council on the United Kingdom, so in the Council of the EU, organized a series of thematic discussions on the EU side to kind of explore what the EU's position would be in any upcoming negotiations, and how member states see the relationship. And I think what's kind of clear from those discussions is that, well, first of all, there is an interest in closer relations with the United Kingdom, but it's also clear that the EU considers kind of the guidelines or the principles that were decided back in 2017 as still valid. So what does that mean? That means that the EU still wants to negotiate as one, so EU unity continues to be really important for them. They also want to continue to keep the right balance of obligations and rights. So there is still this idea that a non-EU member state cannot enjoy the same privileges as an EU member state. There is also the idea that the existing agreements must be implemented fully and in good faith first before negotiations on new areas of cooperation can begin. And there's of course also the fact that the EU has interests of its own. So so what are those interests? I mean, the European Commission published its priorities for the next 5 years. The United Kingdom is mentioned when it comes to relations on security, energy, resilience, and people to people. So that means there is some overlap. I mean, obviously, security is an area which is of interest to both sides. But what's noticeable is that trade doesn't necessarily feature on the EU side of priorities. So I think they have kind of signaled a willingness to explore the UK's demands, so for example, an SPS agreement, but at the same time, they've already defined kind of their interests, what they will be expecting as full alignment and a role for the European Court of Justice, whilst the UK hasn't really said what their position is on that. So I think there is a bit of a risk for the UK side that the EU will come into negotiations with quite a firm position and basically the same red lines as during the last round of negotiations. And of course, the UK also brings its own red lines, which really kind of limits the room for maneuver that the two sides have. So yeah, I think probably security is the most obvious area for kind of where we might see progress more quickly. But I think when it comes to the trading relationship, we will need more patience, and this is going to take time. And we can't be too sure whether this will be successful.
Very relevant advice in all contexts. I'd like to thank everyone for sending in such fantastic questions. I'm actually going to jump straight to them. Of course, it's impossible to talk about the shifting UK-EU relationship without being very cognizant of the wider geopolitical trends, the big radical changes happening beyond the UK and the EU. One of the questions that we've got is, how will Trump in the White House affect UK-EU relations? Stephen.
So if I was going to summarize this, I would say there's 3 things that are probably going to be some of the biggest things that Trump administration is going to mean for the UK-EU relation. I would say tariffs, trade deals, and probably security. And so with that, tariffs, that is obviously the biggest thing. That's the biggest thing we're hearing in the news right now. There's this threat of the 10, now 20% tariff on all trade. He's also targeting even higher ones for Mexico and Canada, and even higher for China. If I was a betting person, I am not, but if I was a betting person, I would put money down that these tariffs are not going to happen for the UK. And I say that because Trump, I think, is using these as a bargaining chip, as a leverage to, and very effectively scare people into coming to the table to agree to terms that are maybe less favorable for them, but are more favorable than if those tariffs were to go into place. I mean, to put it in perspective, a 20% tariff on the UK would equate to about a 0.8% hit to GDP in the first year. Just to put that in perspective, the free trade agreement that we signed with Australia was going to have the same effect on GDP in a positive way, a 0.8% increase to GDP over 15 years. So that is like a 20% tariff would be significant. That's not to say that it would not be hurtful to the UK economy, but I do believe that those tariffs would also hurt US consumers. And that's something I know that Trump would want to avoid. But he wants to bring people to the table. He wants to be able to have leverage against them. I do believe, though, that leads probably right into the next point, is that a Trump administration trade deals. So the UK does not have a free trade agreement with the US. That has been something that has been kind of the white whale of Brexit that has never come about. Boris Johnson tried to get that done under the first Trump administration, was unable to do so. It made it no further under a Biden administration. And now we're in a situation with a Labor government and Trump administration back at it. Here's the difficult part with that, is that the terms of which a free trade agreement would be signed with the US and UK would be probably very likely unfavorable terms for the UK in many areas, especially within agriculture. That is a big touching point. However, what's difficult about this is that oftentimes I think that the UK thinks that if there were to be a free trade agreement with the US, there would be a negotiation. I do not believe there would be a negotiation. I think that if the Trump administration were to pursue a free trade agreement with the UK, it would be, here's a deal, take it or leave it. And that would likely be things such as opening up the NHS to private healthcare or to pharmaceuticals, or to opening up agriculture. There's many have talked about it, whether it's hormone-induced poultry or other aspects that are very unfavorable to the UK and particularly unfavorable to a UK-EU trade relationship. However, I do believe that there is potentially a way for the UK to have to target a deal more towards services, something that services are a majority of the trade that we do with the US, and therefore that there could be a benefit there, and there might be a way for them to avoid that. I would say this: I think that there's been a lot of conversation around, will the UK have to decide between a relationship with the EU or a relationship with the US, that the Trump administration is going to kind of make them choose. I would not my prediction is that they're not going to have to choose all the time. I think that there might be moments, but I do believe that overall and I think that's what Stowers' approach has been, is to say little in order to not put themselves in one place or another, and to kind of try to play this juggling act of being able to kind of appease both. I think that will continue, and I don't know if I would predict that there's not going to be a hard line about that that the UK is going to have to make. I'll briefly just point to security, and I think probably jump over. I think Jannike will probably be even better at this, but I would just say with security that a Trump administration would bring about a very likely a difficult situation for the UKEU when it comes to Ukraine. He has been very clear that he will end the Ukraine war very, very quickly. There is a lot of questions as to how he would do that and if it would be at all to any benefit to Ukraine. And that will definitely make it so that UKEU security cooperation would be very essential. I'll just kind of leave it at that and let Jannike kind of touch more on that. But I do believe that those would be three very key areas that the Trump administration would largely affect the UK-EU relationship.
Yes, let's go directly to Jannike. Let's talk security and foreign policy.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to, very quickly add something to what Stephen just said. I think what's interesting is that Keir Starmer, understandably enough, has denied that the UK faces any kind of choice between the US and the EU. I think the problem with that might be that in the past, this not having to make a choice also relied on the idea of the UK being a bridge between the two sides. And I think the UK's ability to be this bridge has been severely compromised by Brexit, by the UK no longer being in the room when the EU is having discussions and not being able to influence as much as it used to be. And it might be compromised even further by Trump casting doubt on the US security guarantee for Europe. So I think this is going to be increasingly difficult, and the UK kind of finds itself in a bit of a precarious situation there. There's obviously a drive to enhance European military capabilities and for Europe to kind of be able to defend itself. I think the issue with that is that this might cause tensions with the US as well, because actually the outgoing American ambassador to NATO has already criticized the EU's drive to buy European. And for the UK, there's a question mark whether they can and want to participate in those EU initiatives. At the moment, the problem is that those are effectively closed to the UK because they're only open to members of the single market. Now they're still very much in an early stage, so the question is whether member states will actually agree to put enough money behind those proposals that the European Commission has put forward. So there's a big question mark there. But at the same time, I think for the UK this might be quite a tricky position. They will have to increase defense spending. Do you spend this on US military hardware, or do you kind of try to persuade the EU to become a part of the EU's initiatives? Will this mean buying more European military hardware? Is this going to be in the longer run causing issues with the US? So I think there's lots of possible kind of smaller decisions and choices and difficulties that the UK will face, and which are being made more difficult by this combination of Brexit and Trump.
Well, let's stick with this. Given the uncertainty regarding the impact of the Trump administration, and also, Joelle, you alluded to a risk of, I'm picking up on a question from the audience, which is very good. So given there is a risk of drift potentially in the reset of that relationship, do you think that closer bilateral relationships between the UK and some certain EU member states is going to be expected?
Not really. The main reason for that is, I think, one of the greatest legacies of Brexit for the EU side is the importance of member state unity, and that's probably, the single most significant thing which they carry forwards to today is that when they are dealing with the UK on UK matters, there is a primacy which is placed on having alignment between all the member states and not having the risk of some going against others and the UK being able to divide and conquer. That was the absolute essence of their negotiating strategy from 2016 to 2021. And it continues to govern how they manage the relationship. And you still have a working group on the United Kingdom in Brussels, which no other third country has, that kind of emphasizes the still somewhat special position and sensitivity that there is around the UK relationship. And that's also the reason why youth mobility has been such a point of tension in the relationship, is because the Commission does not want some member states getting preferential terms compared to others, because you can imagine the UK would be very happy to have a youth mobility scheme with France, Germany, Spain, but maybe not so much with Bulgaria or Romania. And then you have, different classes of member state when it comes to that relationship on mobility. And while it's true that normally member states are free to sign their own mobility agreements with other third countries, it's an exception for the UK because they all used to have it. They all used to have freedom of movement. And so if some get it back and others don't, then that's potentially something which could be quite rancorous. And so for that reason, I think the Commission is going to keep relations on a very tight leash. And I don't really see what the UK can offer any member state that is going to encourage them to break rank and say, all right, sod this 27 member unity. I just really want, to be able to send more architects to London to do some work. I don't see where that's going to happen. If I had to be sort of a bit more charitable and optimistic about the question, I think there is some potential on security for member state to member state cooperation, because while the Commission has taken more of a lead on that over the course of the first von der Leyen Commission, still a lot of that happens at member state level, and there are clear divisions within the EU as well. Particularly kind of the Nordic and Baltic countries, which take the Russian threat very seriously and are more on and are very much aligned behind Ukraine, and more in line with what I say is the UK has been the UK position on Ukraine, and some other member states that are maybe a little bit more relaxed about how the sort of ongoing conflict is dealt with. And so potentially you have more military alliances on that side, and the UK potentially trying to sort of corral NATO members into increasing their sort of GDP spend as well, which comes back to some of those Trump questions. So yeah, there I can see some progress being made, or some kind of deepening of relations with some member states, and also potentially on the question of migration as well, which is obviously a hot topic in the UK right now. And whilst some of that is kind of an EU level question, and particularly in terms of the Dublin regulations and sort of rights to return asylum seekers and things like that, there are also things which can be done at a UK to member state level, most obviously working with the French authorities on dealing with channel crossings. But we've also seen sort of some light flirtation between Keir Starmer and Giorgia Meloni on questions of how Italy has dealt with migrants and using Albania as a third country for that, for example. So that's another area where you might see some cooperation as well, but this is really marginal, and the core of the UK EU and EU to member state relationship will continue to go through the Commission.
No doubt everyone listening will be very aware of our blog on UKICE Changing Europe, but I will highlight that we have discussed in great detail all of these issues that we're talking about right now, including inviting leading academics from out the UK to also consider these issues. So check out our blog. But let's continue talking about politics and the challenge of politics to the decision-making of governments. A lot of the questions that we're getting are about reform and the rise of the right. Sophie, what does this mean for the UK-EU relationship and the choices that the Labour government can make?
I mean, I think you can get a sense from Labour that they see reform as a threat to their majority, particularly because of how precarious their majority is. You can see that in the fact that, some Labour backbenchers have set up a caucus of MPs where reform did very well in seats of theirs, that is basically aimed at how do we best tackle reform, how do we best stop voters from our voter coalition in July defecting over towards them. So they definitely do see it as a threat, and I think that constrains them because they are worried that Farage and co will jump on them as soon as they make any move towards being, pro-European, towards cooperation, towards closer alignment. That it's basically kind of, red rag to a bull, and it gives reform prime opportunity to attack the government, which is dangerous for them because a lot of those voters who basically lent their vote to Labour in July voted Leave. They made progress, albeit not as much progress as they did in other parts of the country, at winning back votes in the Red Wall in July, and I think they're quite hesitant to undo that progress. And so I do think they feel constrained in the amount of stuff that they're able to do and how much they can get away with without reform tackling them. That then does contrast with what I said at the start, with the fact that actually a majority of Labour voters, and indeed of Labour members, are quite pro-European, or at least they voted Remain in 2016. They're quite open to a closer relationship. So I think they will continuously face this balance of, we want to maintain our voter coalition, we don't want to give reform even more reason to launch an attack on the government to challenge us, and particularly in places like Wales, where Reform are very keen to make progress in Senate elections next year, where there was a large Leave majority, a large chunk of the country voted Leave in 2016. and we're actually a lot of Labour support this time around. That support in Wales was really important to them winning the election, and they won't want to jeopardise that. But then also obviously the pressure from their pro-European contingent to, especially on the backbenchers. Actually, the Labour Movement for Europe group on the Labour backbenchers is quite significant now. So that continuous kind of battle between those two core groups, I think, will be quite difficult for government. At the minute, it's the electoral considerations, I think, that are outweighing the internal considerations.
So do you think it's a sensible political choice to try and not talk about Europe in many ways?
I think it all comes down to the fact that personally, I don't think you can out Farage. You can't be any more stringent on something like migration or the Europe or relationship with Europe than he is. So, and I think Labour are aware of that to an extent, but they are also incredibly cautious of even mentioning something like, free movement or closer cooperation with the EU that could entail free movement. That's something that Labour has ruled out, but even just, I think, giving Reform the opportunity to pounce on that, they're very hesitant to do it. I think the way I would look at it is that, people who voted Reform this time around are not going to vote Labour at the next election, regardless, realistically. If they didn't vote Labour in this election, they're probably not going to. So I think you can strike a balance of being kind of not completely ruling out any closer cooperation. Actually quite a lot of voters are quite pragmatic about if it means cheaper food, on my table. If it means lower energy costs, I'm quite open to some cooperation with Europe. If you can present it in that's actually quite a good middle ground. But to be very clear about what kind of close cooperation doesn't entail, because if you leave it too vague, I think it gives Reform perfect opportunity to jump on it and attack the government. So I'd say there's a middle ground there, but Labour haven't quite figured out how to broach that just yet.
Of course, it's impossible to talk about the rise of the right without talking about the rise of the right in Europe. Do you think there's any common perceptions, Jannike, of the UK and Brexit in right-wing parties in Europe?
I don't think, obviously, well, first thing to say is that obviously the far right has been quite successful in kind of recent elections in member states, but also in the European Parliament elections. But I don't think that these parties necessarily see Brexit as an example they want to follow. If you look at the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD in Germany, for example, and their program for the European Parliament elections, and the AfD is probably one of the more kind of extreme examples. What even they said that what they would like to see first is a reform of the EU, so they want to change the European Union from within, and only kind of if that's not successful, then an exit or a referendum would be a possibility as a second step. So I think this kind of fear of the domino effect, which kind of kept a lot of EU member states awake after the UK referendum, hasn't really taken effect. But nevertheless, I think if you have more far-right governments in the EU in the future, this will have an effect on the UK as well. On the one hand, for Keir Starmer, this means that there are very few centre-left governments and partners in the European Council. You still have kind of two important member states at the moment with Spain and Germany, but Germany has elections in February, and it doesn't look as if the SPD is going to be able to lead the next government coalition in Germany. And Starmer had built quite good relations with the SPD and Scholz, and kind of was in the middle of negotiating a bilateral agreement with Germany, which is now on hold. So these things have an impact on the UK as well. Of course, the shift to the right in the European Parliament and in the Council will also have an impact on EU policy making in areas like climate change, but also migration And we know that kind of EU legislation has a direct impact on the UK as well, be it for trade or level playing field considerations. I think it's still kind of important for the UK's relationships, but I don't think that at the moment Brexit is really seen as kind of a role model that other countries want to follow.
I think so many PhDs have been written over, is Brexit a role model for other countries to follow? But let's go to another question that focuses a little bit more on the UK and the future of the UK. Sophie, in medium to long term, has Brexit increased the possibility of the UK breaking up as voters in Northern Ireland and Scotland maintain the desire and voting patterns to rejoin?
I mean, I would start by saying I'm not an expert on devolution, but from a public opinion perspective, I think what Brexit certainly did was draw attention to just how different voters are in kind of the nations of the United Kingdom. And actually, yeah, how different they continue to be. We've seen that Northern Ireland and particularly Scotland have continued to have a very strong preference for rejoining the EU that is stronger than what we find in England and Wales. And I think actually Brexit also probably drew attention to not only, I think, the lack of understanding, but maybe the lack of primacy that politicians in England have given to Northern Ireland and its unique relationship and place within Europe and the EU. So I think in that sense, maybe, I think it's been, a great line for those in favour of independence in Scotland to pursue for in support of another referendum. And actually, probably one of the reasons that hasn't been more successful is due down to party management more than a reluctance on voters' part. So I think it's definitely maybe drawn attention to the fact that voters in the four nations have very divergent interests, priorities, views on Europe. So potentially it has affected the future of the union. I mean, I think actually what will bring that question back to the table is the Senate elections next year. Reform are very keen to use them as a platform to kind of legitimise almost, I think, their party as a mainstream political party to prove that 2024 was not just kind of a fad election and that they are actually a force in the UK political system. They're going to be helped in doing that by electoral reforms that are being implemented at the next Senate elections. I think actually if you have Reform being a major, if not the major party in one of the nations of the country, that really does bring that to the table. Just how divergent those preferences and interests are. And I think it does put on the question back on the table, that question of, is this really something that we can maintain for a long time?
I think a lot of voters will think in terms of what Stephen has described as the human felt economy. So does it really feel like the economy is doing well? We have an economics question too for Stephen. So what is the impact, or what has the impact on Brexit been on growth? So talk to us about growth and productivity.
Yeah, so there's obviously, I think one of the big numbers out there is the OBR prediction that the impact of Brexit will be 2 to 5%, usually around 4% actually, of a long-term hit on the UK economy. I think with that, obviously Labour's plan is growth. That is what they have been pushing. And that is because even predating Brexit, the UK was having very low growth and low productivity. It was not even just amongst historically speaking, but also comparatively against the OECD. We see that additionally with investment. Foreign direct investment has stagnated since the 2016 referendum. Public investment has fallen significantly. All of this is obviously building out into growth. And Labour has been very, very clear that their plan is to bring growth back to the UK and try to kind of revitalize all of this area. And the thing though is that will this growth be able to replace if the true cost of Brexit is 4%? Will they be able to find that? Probably not. That is enormous. That is enormous growth, 4%. And additionally, the hard part is that growth takes a long time, and it takes a very long-term view to both see the impacts of it and the impacts of policies, and to see kind of the benefit come out of that. And so it's quite difficult because many of the things that will be implemented now will not be seen for 10 to 15 years. Brexit is the same way with that. That's why those predictions are saying we won't see that impact, that clearly. And so it's hard to be able to piece that out. It's hard to be able to say definitively that the plan going forward now is going to reverse that or make significant inroads into bringing some of that growth back, or if the plans are even bold enough to do so. And so it's hard because it takes a very long-term view to be able to piece that out. And we're still, even 5 years on, we still have a ways to go before we can really just see how impactful that's been.
Joelle, regulation has been promised as an opportunity to boost growth and productivity. We have a very technical question for you, which I'm sure you're going to enjoy. Regulatory alignment between the UK and the EU won't automatically mean that the EU will recognise the UK standards as equivalent. How do you manage that risk?
Yeah, that person is really speaking my language, so thank you. But let's put it in terms that might not send everyone else to sleep. So yeah, that is really the essence of this alignment question. And I think it's important to state, you hear this stuff about, okay, Labour wants to align with EU rules. That is not going to buy you access to the EU single market. It doesn't mean that those trade barriers that were created by Brexit are suddenly going to fall away, because the EU's principles are pretty simple. You have to be formally aligned, signed up to the EU legal rulebook if you want to have simplified market access. And the UK is not doing that. It's just copying it onto its own statute book. So it doesn't get you into the market. If you want to do that, you have to either join the single market, join the customs union to an extent, or, and this is, the EU will say you're not allowed to do this, but maybe you are, have selective access to the single market. For example, join, follow the EU rules on veterinary standards, for example, or energy, the internal energy market. That's the way you get closer market access. So then the question is, what is the point of alignment? Why are we bothering to just copy EU rules and regulations if it doesn't get us any better trade than we have now? And the answer is basically to stop it getting any worse than it is at the moment, to stop further drift over time where you have more divergence and therefore more trade friction. So it's you kind of cast in aspects, so to speak, the current regulatory picture and say, this is more or less where we're going to stay. And that has several benefits. One benefit is for business, because you have certainty. That's been kind of the big problem for business. Not only that they have now new non-tariff barriers, but it's you never really know what the regulatory horizon is going to look like from 1 minute to the next, because there's constant change on the EU side. The UK is promising change, doesn't deliver, changes its plans, and that makes it really, really hard to plan ahead. So if the UK can say, okay, we're more or less committing to align with regulations in these areas, then you know at least that there's going to be some degree of predictability in what you're doing, and that alignment with EU standards will also be good enough to get you into the UK market. So you don't need to have two different supply chains. So that probably is the number one benefit. Secondarily, you then have the question around Northern Ireland, which obviously continues to follow, actually maybe not secondarily, maybe sort of equal merit is, Northern Ireland continues to follow a wide range of EU single market regulations. And so as those regulations change, you have new divergence between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That creates new trade friction. It also damages the fabric of the union. That's something, any UK government is keen to avoid if it can. So that's another reason to do it. And then a third and final reason is, and this is very much a Labour thing, wasn't so much a thing for the Conservative government, I think, is to avoid the UK becoming a regulatory laggard or a dumping ground. So say, for example, the EU bans certain types of chemicals or certain types of toys because it thinks they're unsafe, or batteries for electric bikes. If the UK doesn't replicate those rules, we become an obvious market for those goods which are no longer allowed into the EU. So what you have is a proliferation of potentially unsafe or defective goods, not good enough for EU consumers, that are being bought increasingly by our consumers. And I think ideologically, that's something which Labour would like to avoid. So, that is another reason on top of the business certainty and the Northern Ireland question as to why the government sees a merit in alignment.
Final question for the whole panel. In one sentence, what's next Stephen.
What's next? Uncertainty of a possibility. I think that trade is, if we look at what's happened, there's been a lot of uncertainty, but I think we'll see. I think that, yeah, I think Trump brings a lot of uncertainty, but I also do think there's possibility for the UK-EU relationship to grow in a different direction going forward.
Sophie?
I would say, I think in public opinion terms and political terms, it depends on three things. I'd say how the economy is over the next few years, how reform do in elections in Wales and local elections, and also the choices that parties like the Liberal Democrats and the Greens make about what they say about Europe and how much they speak about it.
Jannike?
I think we'll see a fairly quick, probably non-binding joint declaration on foreign policy, security and defense, with some fairly high-level ambition in there, and beyond that, a much slower process of negotiation on trade.
And Joelle?
Lots more warm words, but very little consequential change.
Thank you. And with that, we've come to the very end of our very first lunch hour of 2025. Can I take this opportunity to say what an utter joy it is to work with this research team, and also the silent comms team that is behind us doing incredible work. And in fact, they can use this as a permanent reference letter if they'd like to send a link in future. But can I also thank you so much for joining us on this lunch hour. I hope you had a lovely lunch, and I hope you join us next time. Keep an eye out for our program of events, which is going to be posted in the coming days and weeks.